Picture this. A cold November night. Rain drumming against the windshield. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. And in the back seat of a midnight black sedan sat a woman worth over $300 million. She was silent. Calculating. Watching the world pass by through tinted glass. And behind the wheel was a man who earned $14 an hour. A man whose name no one knew. A man who had spent the last 27 years driving other people to places he could never afford to go. Mansions he would never enter. Restaurants where a single meal cost more than his rent. He was invisible. A shadow. A pair of hands on a steering wheel. But that night, something shifted. She looked at him differently. She asked him a question. And with that question, she set into motion a chain of events that would shatter families, ignite courtrooms, and leave an entire city asking one question. Why him? What did she see in a man the world had overlooked? What was written into her will that made her own blood relatives turn against her memory? And why, even now, years after her death, do people still argue about whether what she did was an act of kindness or something far more complicated? But what no one knew, what no one could have predicted, is that this decision would spark lawsuits, betrayal, public outcry, and a mystery that still divides people today. This is not a fairy tale. This is not about luck. This is about what happens when someone who has everything chooses to give it to someone who has nothing. And the chaos that follows. This is about being invisible your entire life, and then suddenly, terrifyingly, being seen. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So let's pause for a second. Let's ask the real questions. Why him? Out of everyone in her orbit, the lawyers, the business partners, the charity boards, the distant cousins who came crawling out of the woodwork every Christmas, why did she choose a driver? A man who had no Ivy League degree, no stock portfolio, no social media presence. A man whose biggest luxury was an extra shot of espresso on Friday mornings. What did she see? Was it something he said? Something he did? Or was it something deeper? Something that only reveals itself in the quiet moments when no one else is watching? And what was written into her will? What words were chosen so carefully that they would become the center of a legal firestorm? These are the questions that haunted investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives for years. And to answer them, we have to go back. Way back. To a time before the mansion. Before the money. Before the headlines. We have to go back to the beginning. He wasn't family. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't even supposed to be remembered. But sometimes, the most important people in our lives are the ones we least expect. And this story proves that in the most uncomfortable, most beautiful, and most devastating way possible. Because this isn't just about inheritance. It's about what happens when someone finally notices you. When someone finally sees past the uniform, past the job title, past the assumptions. And what that recognition costs. Both the person who gives it, and the person who receives it. Let's call him Daniel. Daniel Hayes. 43 years old. Born and raised in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. His father left when he was 9. Just walked out one Tuesday morning and never came back. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an empty closet and a mother who had to figure out how to raise a son on a cashier's salary. His mother worked 2 jobs, one at a grocery store during the day, one cleaning office buildings at night. Daniel learned early that life didn't owe him anything. He wasn't bitter about it. He just accepted it. That's the kind of man he was. Quiet. Steady. The kind of guy who showed up on time, did his job, and went home. No drama. No complaints. No expectations. He was a good student. Not brilliant, but solid. He liked history. Loved reading about wars and revolutions and the way ordinary people shaped extraordinary events. His high school guidance counselor told him he should think about college. Maybe become a teacher. Daniel liked that idea. He could see himself in a classroom, helping kids who came from places like he did. Kids who needed someone to believe in them. So he enrolled in community college. Took out a small loan. Bought used textbooks. Showed up to every class. But halfway through his first semester, his mother got sick. Pneumonia that turned into something worse. The medical bills piled up. The loan money ran out. And Daniel had to make a choice. School or survival. He chose survival. He dropped out. Got a job at a gas station. Then a warehouse. Then, when he was 29, he got his commercial driver's license and started driving for a private car service. It was supposed to be temporary. Just until he figured out what he really wanted to do. But temporary became 5 years. Then 10. Then 27. He drove executives to the airport at 4 in the morning. He drove celebrities to award shows, waiting for hours in parking garages while they walked red carpets. He drove politicians to secret meetings they pretended never happened. And through it all, he stayed invisible. He didn't ask questions. He didn't gossip. He didn't try to network or make connections. He just drove. Because driving was safe. Driving was predictable. You picked people up. You dropped them off. You got paid. Simple. Daniel lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in a building that smelled like old carpet and fried food. The elevator broke down twice a month. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through the drywall. But the rent was cheap, and it was his. He had a cat named Smokey, a gray tabby he'd found shivering behind a dumpster 3 years earlier. He watched baseball on weekends. He called his mother every Sunday, even though the conversations were always the same. She'd ask if he was eating enough. He'd say yes. She'd ask if he'd met anyone. He'd say no. She'd tell him he worked too hard. He'd tell her he was fine. And they'd both pretend that fine was enough. His life wasn't sad. It was just small. And he had made peace with that. Because peace, he learned, was better than hope. Hope could break you. Hope made you believe things could change, and then crushed you when they didn't. Peace just let you exist. Let you wake up, go to work, come home, feed the cat, and do it all again the next day. It wasn't exciting. But it was safe. And safety, for someone who had grown up with nothing, was worth more than most people understood. But then, on a rainy Tuesday in March, everything changed. He got a last-minute call from dispatch. A high-profile client needed a driver. Her regular guy was sick. Daniel was the only one available. He pulled up to the address. A wrought iron gate. A driveway longer than most streets. A mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie. And standing at the entrance, leaning on a diamond-studded cane, was a woman named Eleanor Grace. Eleanor Grace. 70 years old. Silver hair pulled back in a tight bun that looked like it hurt. Eyes like chips of ice, pale blue and sharp. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car. She didn't smile. Didn't say hello. Just gave him a look that said she was already judging him and he'd already failed. She had built her fortune from nothing. Started with a single dry cleaning shop in the 70s. People told her it wouldn't work. That a woman couldn't run a business. That she should get married, have kids, be normal. She ignored them. Worked 18-hour days. Learned the numbers. Learned the people. Turned one shop into 5. Then 10. Then sold the whole chain for a fortune and invested in real estate. Then tech. Then pharmaceuticals. Every move calculated. Every risk measured. She never made the same mistake twice. People respected Eleanor. But they didn't like her. She was ruthless in business. She fired employees without hesitation. She crushed competitors without mercy. She had no patience for weakness, incompetence, or excuses. She had no children. Never married. Lived alone in that enormous house with a rotating staff that never lasted more than a few months because no one could stand working for her. She was too demanding. Too cold. Too impossible to please. She was brilliant. She was lonely. And she trusted no one. Because in her experience, people were only nice to you when they wanted something. And she had spent 70 years making sure no one ever got close enough to take what she had built. Until that rainy Tuesday when Daniel opened the car door for her, and she looked at him like she was seeing something no one else had noticed before. Their first drive together was silent. 35 minutes to a lawyer's office downtown. Eleanor sat in the back, scrolling through emails on a tablet. Her fingers moved fast, precise. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He adjusted the temperature without asking. Set it to 72 degrees, which he'd learned was what most older clients preferred. He didn't turn on the radio. Didn't try to make small talk. He just drove. Professional. Invisible. The way he'd been trained. But then, as they pulled up to a red light on Fifth Avenue, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was sharp. Direct. Like a scalpel cutting through silence. She asked him if he liked his life. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror. Saw her watching him. Not looking at her phone. Not distracted. Watching. Most drivers would have laughed it off. Given some polite, vague answer about how every job has its ups and downs. But Daniel didn't. He thought about it. Really thought about it. And then he said, honestly, that he didn't love it, but he didn't hate it either. He said it was enough. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. A small movement, but Daniel caught it. She asked what enough meant. He said it meant he had a roof over his head. Food in his fridge. A cat that liked him. He said it meant he didn't have to worry about things a lot of people worried about. That he'd learned a long time ago that wanting more just made you miserable. So he'd stopped wanting. Eleanor didn't respond right away. The light turned green. Daniel drove. 5 more blocks in silence. But when they arrived at her destination, she handed him a folded $50 bill and said, "You're honest. I'll request you next time." Daniel thanked her. Watched her walk into the building, leaning heavily on that diamond cane. He didn't think much of it. Rich people sometimes tipped well. It didn't mean anything. But Eleanor did request him next time. And the time after that. And the time after that. Within 3 months, Daniel was her exclusive driver. Not because dispatch assigned him. But because she refused to ride with anyone else. At first, the other drivers were jealous. Eleanor was a guaranteed tip. A guaranteed easy shift. She never yelled. Never complained. Just sat in the back and worked. But after a few weeks, they stopped caring. Because Eleanor was also exhausting. She had specific preferences. The temperature had to be exactly 72. The radio had to be off. The car had to be spotless, not just clean, but spotless. No air fresheners. No visible dust on the dashboard. And if you were even 2 minutes late, she'd call the company and complain. So the other drivers were happy to let Daniel deal with her. Let him have the hassle. They'd take the easy clients. The ones who didn't care if you showed up 5 minutes late or had a coffee stain on the seat. But Daniel didn't mind. He liked the structure. Liked knowing exactly what was expected. And slowly, over the course of those first few months, something unexpected started to happen. Eleanor started talking. Not about work. Not about the weather. About real things. It started small. She asked him where he grew up. He told her. She asked if he had family. He told her about his mother. About his father leaving. She didn't offer sympathy. Didn't say she was sorry. Just nodded like she understood. And then one day, she told him about her own father. How he'd been a mechanic. How he'd worked himself to death trying to provide for a family that never appreciated it. How she'd learned from watching him that loyalty was a weakness people exploited. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. So he didn't say anything. He just listened. And that, he would later realize, was exactly what she needed. Someone who didn't try to fix her. Didn't try to argue or offer platitudes. Someone who just let her be exactly who she was. Over the next year, their drives became longer. Eleanor started requesting him for trips that didn't make sense. A meeting across town that could have been a phone call. A dinner reservation she could have walked to. She was creating reasons to be in the car. Creating reasons to talk. And Daniel, who had spent his entire life being invisible, found himself being seen. And it was terrifying. And it was wonderful. Eleanor told him things she'd never told anyone. About the men who had underestimated her. About the board meetings where she'd had to be twice as smart and twice as ruthless just to be taken half as seriously. About the sacrifices she'd made. The relationships she'd ended. The family she'd pushed away because they wanted her money but not her. She told him about the first million she made and how empty it felt. About the 10th million and how it felt exactly the same. She told him she'd spent 70 years building an empire, and now that she was standing on top of it, she realized she was completely alone. Daniel didn't try to make her feel better. Didn't tell her it wasn't true. Because it was true. And she knew it. Instead, he told her about the warehouse. About the years he spent loading boxes onto trucks, coming home every night with a sore back and hands covered in splinters. About the dream he gave up of becoming a history teacher. About how he used to think that if he just worked hard enough, eventually something would change. But nothing ever did. And eventually, he stopped expecting it to. Eleanor looked at him in the rearview mirror and said, "Most people lie to themselves. Tell themselves they're happy when they're not. You don't do that." Daniel shrugged. Said lying took too much energy. Eleanor smiled. A real smile. The first one he'd ever seen from her. And in that moment, something shifted between them. They weren't client and driver anymore. They were two people who understood what it meant to be alone in a crowded world. Over the next 2 years, Daniel and Eleanor developed a routine. He picked her up every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 in the morning. Drove her to her office downtown. Waited while she had meetings. Drove her to lunch. Waited again. Drove her home. Sometimes the drives were quiet. Sometimes they talked for hours. Eleanor asked him questions no one had ever asked him before. What did he think about when he couldn't sleep? If he could go back and change one thing, what would it be? What scared him? What made him angry? And Daniel, who had spent his entire life keeping his thoughts to himself, found himself answering honestly. Because Eleanor didn't judge. Didn't offer advice unless he asked for it. She just listened. And in a world that never stopped talking, that silence was a gift. But their relationship didn't go unnoticed. The household staff started whispering. Eleanor's longtime housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret, made comments about how unusual it was for Mrs. Grace to request the same driver every single time. Eleanor's personal assistant, a nervous young man named Trevor, mentioned to Eleanor that it might be wise to rotate drivers, just to avoid any appearance of favoritism. Eleanor told Trevor to mind his own business. She didn't care what people thought. She'd spent 70 years caring what people thought, and it had gotten her nothing but a big house and an empty life. She was done performing. Done pretending. If she wanted to talk to her driver, she'd talk to her driver. And if people had a problem with that, they could find somewhere else to work. Eleanor's financial advisor, a sharp-eyed man named Richard Pemberton, was more direct. He asked Eleanor, carefully, if she was aware of how her behavior might be perceived. Eleanor asked him what he meant. Richard said that people might get the wrong idea. That they might think Daniel was taking advantage of her. Eleanor laughed. A cold, sharp laugh. She said the only people who had ever taken advantage of her were the ones in expensive suits who pretended to care about her best interests while billing her $500 an hour. Daniel had never asked her for a single thing. Never hinted at wanting anything. He just showed up. On time. Every time. And treated her like a person instead of a walking checkbook. Richard backed off. But he didn't stop watching. Eleanor's distant relatives started calling more often. Cousins she hadn't spoken to in years. A nephew who suddenly wanted to have lunch. A niece who sent a Christmas card with a long, chatty letter about her kids. Eleanor saw right through it. They'd heard she was spending time with her driver. They were worried. Not about her. About their inheritance. About the money they'd been quietly counting on even though Eleanor had never promised them a dime. She started screening their calls. Stopped responding to emails. She told Margaret to tell anyone who dropped by unannounced that she wasn't available. She was tired of vultures. Tired of people who only cared about her when there was something to gain. But Daniel never asked for anything. Not once. When Eleanor offered to pay for his mother's medical bills, he refused. Said he'd handle it himself. When she suggested he move to a better apartment, he said he liked where he lived. When she tried to give him a bonus at Christmas, he said the tips were already too generous. Eleanor found his refusal both frustrating and refreshing. Everyone else in her life wanted something. Money. Access. Connections. But Daniel didn't want any of it. He just wanted to do his job. And maybe, just maybe, have someone to talk to. Someone who understood what it was like to be lonely in a city full of people. One evening in late spring, Eleanor asked Daniel to drive her to a park by the river. Not for a meeting. Not for an appointment. Just to sit. They parked near a bench overlooking the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Eleanor got out of the car, leaned on her cane, and walked slowly to the bench. Daniel followed. They sat in silence for a long time. Watching the light change. Watching joggers pass by. Watching life happen around them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. She said she'd been thinking about what happened after you died. Not heaven or hell or any of that religious talk. But legacy. What you left behind. She said she'd spent her whole life building something, but she didn't know what it was for. Didn't know who it mattered to. Daniel thought about that. Then he said maybe legacy wasn't about buildings or bank accounts. Maybe it was about the people you touched. The small kindnesses that didn't make headlines. Eleanor asked if he really believed that. Daniel said he didn't know. But he hoped so. Because otherwise, what was the point of any of it? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're a good man, Daniel. Better than you know." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. So he just said thank you. And they sat there until the sun disappeared completely. Two lonely people finding something like comfort in each other's silence. But comfort, Daniel would soon learn, always came with a price. Because 3 months later, Eleanor called him on a Sunday morning. Her voice was different. Shaky. She asked him to come to the house. Not to drive her anywhere. Just to come. Daniel threw on clothes and drove over, breaking the speed limit for the first time in his life. When he arrived, Margaret let him in. Her eyes were red. She led him to Eleanor's study. Eleanor was sitting in a leather chair by the window, staring out at the garden. She looked smaller somehow. Friendlier. She turned when he came in and told Margaret to leave them alone. Margaret hesitated. Then left. Eleanor looked at Daniel and said, "I'm dying." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt the floor shift under him. He asked what she meant. She said pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors had given her 6 months. Maybe less. She'd known for 2 weeks. Hadn't told anyone. Didn't want the pity. Didn't want the circus. But she needed to tell someone. And he was the only person she trusted to hear it without falling apart. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair across from her. His hands were shaking. He didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who just told you they're dying? Eleanor said she didn't want sympathy. She wanted honesty. So he gave it to her. He said he was sorry. That she deserved more time. That it wasn't fair. Eleanor laughed. A sharp, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. She said fairness had nothing to do with it. Life wasn't fair. It never had been. She'd known that since she was 10 years old, watching her father collapse from exhaustion. Fair was a story people told themselves to make sense of chaos. But chaos didn't care. Cancer didn't care. Death didn't care. It came for everyone eventually. Rich or poor. Good or bad. It didn't matter. Daniel asked what she was going to do. Eleanor said she was going to keep living until she couldn't anymore. She wasn't going to waste her last months in a hospital. Wasn't going to let doctors pump her full of chemicals that would only buy her a few extra weeks of misery. She was going to live on her own terms. And when it was time, she'd go on her own terms too. Then she asked him a question. She asked what he would do if he had 6 months to live. Daniel thought about it. Really thought about it. And he said he'd probably do exactly what he was doing now. Driving. Talking. Trying to make the days count, even if they were small. Eleanor looked at him like he'd just said something profound. And maybe he had. Because in that moment, Eleanor made a decision. She told him she was going to update her will. She didn't tell him what that meant. Didn't give details. She just said that she wanted to make sure the people who mattered were taken care of. Daniel assumed she meant family. Distant relatives who would finally get what they'd been circling for. He didn't think anything of it. Didn't realize that when Eleanor said people who mattered, she wasn't talking about her family. She was talking about him. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps this story reach more people like you. Over the next few months, Eleanor's health declined. Slowly at first. She moved a little slower. Leaned a little heavier on her cane. Some days, she didn't want to go anywhere. Just wanted Daniel to drive her around the city. No destination. Just movement. Just the feeling of still being alive. Daniel cleared his schedule. Told Dispatch he was unavailable for other clients. He didn't care if it hurt his income. Eleanor needed him. And after everything, he wasn't going to let her down. They drove through neighborhoods she used to know. Past the building where her first dry cleaning shop had been. It was a coffee shop now. Eleanor stared at it for a long time. Said she could still smell the chemicals. Still hear the hiss of the steam press. Still remember the feeling of signing her first business loan, hands shaking, knowing that if she failed, she'd lose everything. Daniel asked if she ever regretted it. The business. The choices. The things she gave up. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said no. She didn't regret the success. She regretted the cost. The relationships she'd sacrificed. The people she'd pushed away because she was too busy, too focused, too afraid to let anyone close. She said she'd spent 70 years building walls to protect herself. And now, at the end, those walls were all she had left. Daniel said it wasn't too late. That she could reach out. Try to rebuild. Eleanor shook her head. Said some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. And she didn't have the energy to try. She'd made her choices. She'd live with them. Or die with them. But she didn't want to die alone. She told Daniel that. Late one night, as they sat in the car outside her house, the engine still running. She said she'd always imagined dying would be like going to sleep. Quiet. Peaceful. But now that it was close, she realized it was terrifying. Not the death itself. But the loneliness of it. The idea of taking that final breath with no one there to witness it. No one to care. Daniel reached back and took her hand. His was rough, calloused from years of gripping a steering wheel. Hers was thin, fragile, spotted with age. He told her she wouldn't be alone. That he'd be there. As long as she wanted him there. Eleanor squeezed his hand. And for the first time in 70 years, she cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks. And Daniel sat with her. Didn't try to fix it. Didn't try to make it better. Just sat with her in her grief. Eleanor started putting her affairs in order. She met with lawyers. Updated documents. Made arrangements. She asked Daniel to drive her to the cemetery where her parents were buried. It was an hour outside the city. A small, quiet place with old trees and worn headstones. Eleanor stood at her parents' graves for a long time. Daniel stayed by the car, giving her space. When she came back, she looked exhausted. But also lighter somehow. Like she'd put down a weight she'd been carrying for decades. She told Daniel she'd purchased the plot next to her mother. Said it felt right. Like coming home. Daniel said nothing. Just helped her into the car and drove her back to the city. The household staff noticed the change. Eleanor was kinder. More patient. She thanked Margaret for things she used to take for granted. She asked Trevor about his life, his family, his plans. She even wrote generous severance checks for everyone on her staff, telling them they could leave now if they wanted. That she didn't want them to feel obligated to stay through the end. Most of them stayed. Not because they had to. But because, for the first time, they felt like Eleanor actually saw them as people. And that changed something. But Eleanor's relatives became more aggressive. The nephew showed up unannounced, demanding to speak with her. Margaret turned him away. The niece called repeatedly, insisting she just wanted to help, wanted to be there for Eleanor in her final days. Eleanor saw through it. She told her assistant to stop taking their calls. She told her lawyer to make sure her will was airtight. She knew what was coming. Knew that the moment she died, the vultures would descend. And she wanted to make sure they didn't get what they expected. Then one morning in early December, Eleanor didn't call for a ride. Daniel waited. Called her phone. No answer. Called the house. Margaret answered, her voice breaking. She said Eleanor had passed away in her sleep. Peaceful. No pain. Just a quiet ending. Daniel sat in his car in the parking lot of a coffee shop and cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs. Just silent tears that he wiped away quickly because he had another client scheduled in 45 minutes. He went through the motions. Picked up the client. Dropped them off. Went home. Fed Smokey. Sat on the couch. Stared at the wall. He felt hollowed out. Like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that mattered. He went to the funeral 3 days later. It was held at a massive church downtown. Hundreds of people showed up. Business leaders. Politicians. Society types who probably hadn't spoken to Eleanor in years but wanted to be seen. Daniel stood in the back. Didn't speak to anyone. Watched as distant relatives he'd never seen before dabbed at dry eyes and gave speeches about a woman they barely knew. They talked about her success. Her brilliance. Her legacy. But none of them talked about her loneliness. None of them talked about the real Eleanor. The one who cried in the back of a car. The one who was terrified of dying alone. Daniel left before the service ended. Walked out into the cold December air and drove home. He thought that was the end of it. A chapter closed. A friendship lost. A job finished. But 2 weeks later, a lawyer called him. And that's when everything he thought he knew exploded. The lawyer's name was Martin Greaves. He worked for Preston, Whitmore and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. The kind of place where the receptionist wore designer clothes and the coffee was served in actual china. Martin's voice on the phone was professional. Clipped. He asked Daniel to come to his office. Wouldn't say why. Just said it was regarding Eleanor Grace's estate. Daniel assumed maybe she'd left him a small token. A watch, maybe. Or a thank you note. Something symbolic. He'd heard that wealthy people sometimes did that. Left little gifts to staff members. A way of saying they'd mattered. He borrowed a blazer from a friend. Wore his one pair of dress shoes. Took the bus downtown because parking was too expensive. He walked into that glass and steel office building feeling completely out of place. The lobby had marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than his car. A receptionist with perfect makeup directed him to the 14th floor. The elevator was so quiet it felt like floating. When the doors opened, another receptionist, this one male and equally polished, led him down a hallway lined with oil paintings and plaques. Awards. Recognitions. Proof of success. Daniel's shoes squeaked on the floor. He felt like everyone could tell he didn't belong. Martin Greaves was waiting in a conference room. Expensive suit. Perfectly combed hair. Wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when Daniel entered, shook his hand with the kind of firm grip that felt practiced, and gestured to a leather chair. Martin didn't waste time on small talk. He slid a folder across the table and told Daniel to read it. The folder was thick. Legal documents. Pages and pages of words that didn't make sense. Daniel started reading. Slowly at first. Then faster. His hands started to shake. He read the same paragraph 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding. But he wasn't. The words were clear. Eleanor Grace had left him $12 million. A house. A car. And a seat on the board of her charitable foundation. Daniel looked up at Martin, mouth dry, heart pounding. He said there had to be a mistake. Martin just shook his head. No mistake. Eleanor had updated her will 4 months ago. Had been very specific about what she wanted. Very clear about her intentions. Daniel asked why. Why him? Martin opened another folder. Pulled out a letter. Handwritten. In Eleanor's sharp, precise script. He slid it across the table. The letter was short. Just 2 paragraphs. But every word felt like a punch to the chest. Eleanor wrote that she had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Money. Power. Access. Approval. But Daniel had never wanted anything. He had just shown up. Day after day. Year after year. He had listened when she needed to talk. Had been silent when she needed silence. Had treated her like a person instead of a transaction. And in doing that, he had given her something she thought she'd lost forever. Dignity. She wrote that she wasn't leaving him her money out of pity. She was leaving it to him because he had earned it. Because kindness, real kindness, was worth more than most people understood. And because she wanted him to have the chance to build a life that wasn't defined by struggle. She wanted him to have choices. Freedom. The ability to help others the way he had helped her. She ended the letter with one sentence. Don't waste this, Daniel. And don't let them make you feel guilty for it. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he put it down and asked Martin what happens next. Martin explained the process. Probate. Legal requirements. Paperwork. But he also warned Daniel that Eleanor's family was going to fight this. That they'd already started. That Daniel should prepare himself for a battle. Daniel asked what kind of battle. Martin said the kind where they'd dig into every moment Daniel spent with Eleanor. Every conversation. Every drive. They'd try to prove he manipulated her. Coerced her. Took advantage of a dying woman. They'd drag his name through the mud. Make him look like a villain. And there was nothing Martin could do to stop it. He could only try to minimize the damage. Daniel sat there, stunned. He didn't want the money. Didn't want the house. Didn't want any of it. He just wanted Eleanor back. Wanted one more drive. One more conversation. But that wasn't possible. So he asked Martin what he should do. Martin said, fight. Because if you don't, you're letting them erase what Eleanor wanted. And she wanted this. Daniel left that office in a daze. Walked the 12 blocks back to his apartment because he couldn't process what had just happened. $12 million. The number didn't even feel real. He'd never had more than $3,000 in his bank account at one time. 12 million was an abstraction. A number that belonged to other people. Not to him. He climbed the stairs to his apartment. 3 flights because the elevator was still broken. Unlocked his door. Smokey meowed, hungry. Daniel fed him. Then sat on the couch and stared at the wall. He didn't feel rich. He felt terrified. Because he knew what was coming. The scrutiny. The judgment. The accusations. And he didn't know if he was strong enough to survive it. The news broke 3 days later. Not because Daniel wanted it to. But because Eleanor's relatives had already started leaking information to the press. Framing the narrative. Controlling the story. The headline in the city's biggest newspaper read, "Billionaire's shocking bequest sparks family outrage." The article painted Daniel as an opportunist. A manipulator. A man who had somehow convinced a vulnerable, dying woman to sign over her fortune. It quoted Eleanor's nephew, a man named Preston Whitmore, the same Whitmore whose name was on the law firm letterhead, saying that the family was deeply concerned about Eleanor's mental state in her final months. That they believed she had been unduly influenced. That they intended to challenge the will in court. Within hours, the story exploded. Local news picked it up. Then national outlets. Social media went crazy. People who had never heard of Eleanor Grace suddenly had opinions about what she should have done with her money. About whether Daniel deserved it. About whether the whole thing was a scam. Daniel's face was plastered across television screens. His name was trending on Twitter. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. His phone rang non-stop. Unknown numbers. Blocked numbers. People demanding interviews. Offering book deals. Threatening lawsuits. Daniel stopped answering. Stopped looking at his phone. But he couldn't escape it. Because strangers recognized him now. At the grocery store. At the gas station. Some smiled. Some glared. Most just stared. Like he was an exhibit in a museum. Something to be examined and judged. The accusations got worse. A tabloid ran a story suggesting Daniel and Eleanor had been romantically involved. That he had seduced a lonely old woman for her money. The story was complete fiction. But it didn't matter. People believed it. Shared it. Commented on it. Daniel felt sick. Eleanor had been like a friend. A mentor. Someone who saw him as more than just a job. And now people were twisting that into something ugly. Something shameful. His mother called, crying. Asked him if it was true. If he'd really inherited all that money. Daniel said yes. She asked if he deserved it. And he said he didn't know. He honestly didn't know. Eleanor's relatives filed the official challenge 2 weeks after the will was read. They claimed Eleanor had not been of sound mind when she updated her will. That she had been suffering from the effects of her illness. That Daniel had isolated her from her family. Had manipulated her into changing her wishes. They brought in doctors who had never treated Eleanor but were willing to testify that cancer patients often experienced cognitive decline. They brought in handwriting experts to analyze her signature. They brought in psychologists to talk about undue influence and how vulnerable people could be coerced. The case was going to trial. And Daniel was going to have to defend himself in front of the world. His lawyer, Martin Greaves, assembled a defense team. They interviewed Eleanor's household staff. Her actual doctors. Her financial advisors. They pulled phone records. Email logs. Security footage from the estate. They were looking for evidence that Eleanor had been clear-minded. That she had made her decision independently. That Daniel had not pressured or manipulated her in any way. And they found it. Because Eleanor had been meticulous. She had documented everything. Every meeting with her lawyers. Every amendment to her will. Every decision carefully explained and justified. She had known this was coming. Had prepared for it. Had left a paper trail that proved she had been in complete control. But public opinion was harder to manage. The media loved a scandal. Loved a story about a poor driver and a rich old lady. It fit too many narratives. Class warfare. Gold diggers. The vulnerability of the elderly. Think pieces appeared in every major publication. Some defended Daniel. Said Eleanor had the right to do whatever she wanted with her money. Others condemned him. Said he should have refused. That accepting the inheritance was proof of guilt. Daniel stopped reading the articles. Stopped watching the news. But he couldn't stop living. He still had to eat. Still had to go outside. And every time he did, he felt the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing down on him. His old co-workers avoided him. Some out of jealousy. Some out of discomfort. The company where he'd worked for over a decade quietly let him go. Said it was a conflict of interest. That his situation was too complicated. Too distracting. Daniel didn't fight it. He didn't have the energy. He spent his days in his apartment. Feeding Smokey. Staring at the walls. Wondering how his life had turned into something he didn't recognize. Wondering if Eleanor had known this would happen. If she had understood the price he'd have to pay. And wondering if it was worth it. Because right now, sitting alone in a tiny apartment while the world called him a thief, it didn't feel worth it at all. But then, 6 months into the legal battle, something happened that changed everything. A witness came forward. Someone who had been silent. Watching. Waiting for the right moment. Her name was Grace Lynn. And what she had to say would shift the entire narrative. Grace Lynn was Eleanor's housekeeper. Not Margaret, who had been with Eleanor for years and had already testified. Grace was newer. She'd been hired just 13 months before Eleanor died. She was young, 26, an immigrant from Taiwan who spoke careful, deliberate English. She had stayed silent during the initial media frenzy because she was undocumented. Her visa had expired 2 years earlier. She was terrified that if she drew attention to herself, she'd be deported. So she watched the trial unfold from a distance. Watched the family tear Daniel apart. Watched them paint Eleanor as a confused, manipulated victim. And it made her sick. Because Grace had been there. She had seen the truth. And finally, after months of watching lies spread like poison, she couldn't stay silent anymore. She reached out to Martin Greaves through a legal aid organization. Said she had information about Eleanor Grace. That she had worked in the house during Eleanor's final year. That she had seen things. Heard things. Martin brought her in immediately. Had her sign an affidavit. Prepared her to testify. And when she took the stand, everything changed. Grace spoke quietly but clearly. She described Eleanor as sharp. Focused. Fully in control. She said Eleanor had talked about Daniel often. Had said he reminded her of herself when she was younger. Scrappy. Honest. Not impressed by wealth. Grace said Eleanor had laughed when she updated her will. Not a cruel laugh. A satisfied one. Like she was getting away with something. Like she was beating a system that had never been fair to her. Grace testified that Eleanor had told her, word for word, they'll hate this. My family. They've been circling like vultures for years, waiting for me to die so they can fight over the scraps. But I'm not giving them what they want. I'm giving it to someone who actually deserves it. Grace said Eleanor had been completely clear-headed when she said that. That there had been no confusion. No hesitation. Just cold, calculated intention. The courtroom was silent. You could hear people breathing. The family's lawyers tried to discredit Grace. Pointed out that she was undocumented. Suggested she had been paid to testify. But Grace didn't flinch. She said she was risking everything by being there. That she could be arrested the moment she walked out of that courthouse. But she was there because it was the right thing to do. Because Eleanor had been kind to her. Had treated her with dignity when most people treated her like she was invisible. And Grace wasn't going to let Eleanor's memory be destroyed by people who had never cared about her. The testimony was devastating. But it wasn't the only bombshell. Because Martin had been holding something back. Something Eleanor had left specifically for this moment. A video. Recorded 3 weeks before her death. The judge allowed it. The lights dimmed. A screen lowered from the ceiling. And there she was. Eleanor Grace. Sitting in her study. The same room where Daniel had so many conversations with her. She looked frail. Thin. Her skin pale. But her eyes were sharp. Focused. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. Strong. She spoke for 11 minutes. And in those 11 minutes, she dismantled every argument the family had made. She started by saying she knew this video would only be played if her will was contested. That she knew her family would fight. That she had expected it. She said she had spent 70 years watching people pretend to care about her when all they really cared about was her money. Her nephew, Preston, who called twice a year to ask for loans he never paid back. Her niece, Diane, who only showed up when she needed something. Her cousins, who sent Christmas cards but never visited. She said they had proven, time and time again, that they didn't love her. They loved what she represented. Security. Status. A safety net they hadn't earned. But Daniel, she said, had never asked for anything. Not once. She recounted the first drive. The conversation at the stoplight. The honesty that had surprised her. She talked about the hours they spent driving through the city. The conversations about regret and loneliness and what it meant to live a meaningful life. She said Daniel had given her something no one else had. The feeling of being seen. Not as Eleanor Grace, billionaire. But as Eleanor. A person. A woman who was scared and lonely and running out of time. She said she wasn't leaving him her money because she pitied him. She was leaving it to him because he had reminded her what kindness looked like. What humanity looked like. And she wanted him to have the chance she never had. The chance to build a life that wasn't defined by fear or scarcity or the need to prove himself. And then, in the final moments of the video, Eleanor looked directly into the camera. Her eyes hard. Unflinching. And she said, "If you're watching this, it means my family is fighting. And I'm not surprised. But I want to be very clear. This is my decision. My money. My choice. I earned every dollar. I sacrificed everything to build what I built. And I'll give it to whoever the hell I want. If Daniel is half the man I believe he is, he'll use it well. And if my family wants to fight him, they can. But they won't win. Because I made damn sure of that." The screen went black. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Eleanor's relatives sat frozen, faces pale. And Daniel, sitting at the defendant's table, put his head in his hands and cried. The trial lasted 3 more days. But everyone knew it was over. Eleanor's video had destroyed the family's case. Her own words, spoken with clarity and conviction, had proven that she had been fully in control. That Daniel had not manipulated her. That this had been her choice. The family's lawyers made a few more attempts. Brought in more experts. Tried to argue that the video had been recorded under duress. But it didn't matter. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Moreno, had seen enough. She reviewed the evidence one final time. The medical records proving Eleanor had been of sound mind. The testimonies from her doctors. Grace's testimony. The video. And then she made her ruling. The will would stand. Eleanor's wishes would be honored. Daniel Hayes would inherit. The courtroom erupted again. Eleanor's relatives shouted. Reporters pushed toward the exits. Daniel just sat there, numb. He had won. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. Like crawling out of a wreckage that had nearly destroyed him. Martin Greaves shook his hand. Told him it was over. That he could move on now. But Daniel didn't know how to move on. Didn't know who he was anymore. He'd spent the last year being called a thief. A liar. A manipulator. And even though the court had vindicated him, the accusations still echoed in his head. He wondered if they always would. Eleanor's family dropped all legal challenges the next day. Not because they accepted the ruling. But because continuing to fight would only make them look worse. They released a statement through their lawyers. Said they respected the court's decision. That they hoped Daniel would honor Eleanor's legacy. But everyone knew it was hollow. They didn't care about Eleanor's legacy. They cared about saving face. About moving on. About pretending they had been concerned relatives instead of opportunistic vultures. The media coverage shifted. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't a villain. He was a symbol. A modern-day rags-to-riches story. The underdog who won. Headlines praised his integrity. His humility. His refusal to back down. But Daniel didn't read them. He'd learned that public opinion was fickle. That people would turn on you the moment it suited them. And he didn't want to live his life at the mercy of what strangers thought. He moved out of his apartment 3 weeks after the trial ended. Not into Eleanor's mansion. He couldn't bring himself to live there. It felt too big. Too empty. Too much like a museum dedicated to a life he hadn't lived. Instead, he bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood on the east side. 3 bedrooms. A backyard. Nothing fancy. But it was his. He furnished it simply. Kept most of Eleanor's money untouched. He didn't know what to do with it yet. Didn't trust himself to make the right choices. So he waited. Thought. Tried to figure out what Eleanor would have wanted. His mother visited him in the new house. She walked through the rooms, touching the walls like she couldn't believe they were real. She asked if he was happy. Daniel said he didn't know. He said he felt like he was living someone else's life. Like he was wearing clothes that didn't fit. His mother hugged him. Told him it would take time. That big changes always felt strange at first. But eventually, he'd find his footing. Daniel hoped she was right. But he wasn't sure. Because the person he'd been before, the invisible driver, the man who just showed up and went home, that person was gone. And he didn't know who he was now. He started seeing a therapist. A kind woman named Dr. Patel who didn't judge him. Didn't tell him how to feel. Just helped him process. They talked about grief. About guilt. About the weight of being given something you didn't ask for. Dr. Patel asked him what he wanted. Not what Eleanor wanted. Not what the world expected. What he wanted. Daniel said he didn't know. He'd spent his whole life not wanting. Not hoping. Just existing. And now that he had the freedom to want anything, he felt paralyzed. Dr. Patel said that was normal. That it would take time to learn how to dream again. And Daniel held on to that. Held on to the idea that maybe, eventually, this would feel like his life instead of a borrowed one. Then, 3 months after the trial, Daniel made a decision. A decision that no one expected. A decision that would redefine everything. Daniel called a press conference. Martin Greaves advised against it. Said the media would twist his words. Use them against him. But Daniel didn't care. He needed to do this. Needed to say it out loud. The press conference was held at a community center on the south side of the city. The same neighborhood where he grew up. Where his mother still lived. Where kids played basketball on cracked courts and families struggled to make rent. The room was small. Just a few folding chairs. A makeshift podium. A handful of local reporters who showed up out of curiosity. Daniel stood at the podium, hands shaking. He'd written a speech. Practiced it a dozen times. But now, looking at the faces in front of him, the words felt wrong. So he put the paper aside and just spoke from the heart. He said he wanted to set the record straight. That he had never asked Eleanor for anything. That their friendship had been real. That she had been one of the most remarkable people he'd ever known. And that losing her had broken something in him that he didn't know how to fix. He said he'd spent the last year being called a thief. A manipulator. A fraud. And even though the court had cleared him, the accusations still hurt. Still made him question himself. Made him wonder if he deserved any of this. But then he thought about what Eleanor had said. About kindness. About giving people a chance. About using what you have to make the world a little less broken. And he realized he had a choice. He could keep the money. Live comfortably. Never work again. Or he could do something that mattered. So he announced that he was giving away most of the inheritance. Not all of it. He kept enough to pay off his mother's medical bills. Enough to keep the house. Enough to live on without worrying about rent or groceries or unexpected expenses. But the rest, nearly $10 million, was going into a scholarship fund. For kids like him. Kids who couldn't afford college. Kids who had dreams but no way to reach them. Kids who deserved a chance. He named it the Eleanor Grace Second Chance Fund. And he would serve as its first board member. The room was silent. Then one reporter raised her hand. Asked the question everyone was thinking. Why? Why give it away? Daniel looked at her. Thought about Eleanor. About the conversations they'd had. About the way she'd looked at him in the rearview mirror and seen something no one else had. And he said, because Eleanor didn't give me this money to make me rich. She gave it to me to make me free. And the freest thing I can do is pass it on. She believed in second chances. She gave me one. And now I'm giving other people theirs. The reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. And for the first time in over a year, Daniel felt like he'd done something right. Like he'd honored Eleanor in a way that mattered. The story exploded. Again. But this time, the coverage was different. Positive. Inspiring. Headlines called him a hero. A modern saint. A man who turned tragedy into triumph. But Daniel didn't read them. He'd learned his lesson. Public opinion didn't matter. What mattered was doing the work. So he did. He partnered with local schools. Set up an application process. Hired a small team to review submissions. And within 6 months, the first scholarships were awarded. 20 students. Kids from broken homes and tough neighborhoods. Kids who worked 2 jobs while going to school. Kids who reminded him of himself. He met each of them personally. Shook their hands. Told them they deserved this. That they'd earned it. And he saw in their faces the same disbelief he'd felt sitting in Martin Greaves's office. The same fear that it was too good to be true. But it was true. And he made sure they knew it. He stayed involved. Checked in with them. Offered advice when they asked for it. Became a mentor. A guide. Someone who understood what it was like to feel invisible and then suddenly seen. And in doing that, he found something he hadn't expected. Purpose. Meaning. A reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just survival. Eleanor's mansion was sold. The proceeds went into the foundation. Daniel didn't keep any of it. Didn't want it. The house had been Eleanor's dream. Not his. He attended the sale. Walked through the empty rooms one last time. Stood in the study where they'd had so many conversations. Where she'd recorded that video. Where she'd told him he was a good man. He whispered thank you to the empty air. And then he left. Let someone else fill those rooms with their own dreams. But the story, Daniel would soon learn, wasn't over. Because 2 years later, something happened that would reveal the final piece of the puzzle. The final secret Eleanor had kept. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. 2 years to the day since Eleanor had asked him to pull over by the river. Since she'd told him she was dying. Daniel was in his office at the foundation. A modest space in a shared building downtown. Nothing fancy. Just a desk, a computer, and filing cabinets full of scholarship applications. He was reviewing a submission from a young woman who wanted to study engineering when his assistant knocked on the door. Said there was someone here to see him. Daniel looked up. A woman stood in the doorway. Mid-50s. Well-dressed but not flashy. She had Eleanor's eyes. That same sharp, intelligent gaze. She introduced herself as Claire. Eleanor's niece. Not one of the relatives who had fought the will. A different branch of the family. Quieter. More distant. Daniel invited her in. Offered her coffee. She declined. Said she wouldn't take much of his time. She just had something to give him. Something Eleanor had made her promise to keep secret until the right moment. And she believed the right moment had come. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out an old envelope. Yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front was Eleanor's. Sharp. Precise. It was addressed to Daniel. But dated 5 years before they ever met. Daniel stared at it, confused. Claire explained. She said Eleanor had written this letter years ago. Had given it to Claire with specific instructions. Not to be opened or delivered until Daniel had proven himself. Until he had shown what kind of man he really was. And now, watching what he'd done with the foundation, Claire believed he'd proven it. Daniel's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was short. Just a few paragraphs. But what it said changed everything Daniel thought he knew about his relationship with Eleanor. The letter started with an apology. Eleanor wrote that she had lied. Not about her feelings. Not about her reasons for leaving him the inheritance. But about how they'd met. She wrote that their first drive hadn't been a coincidence. That she had known who he was before he ever picked her up. Daniel's heart pounded. He kept reading. 5 years before they met, Eleanor had been visiting a friend. An elderly woman named Mrs. Rossi who lived in a modest apartment building on the south side. Daniel had been Mrs. Rossi's driver that day. Had helped her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs when the elevator was broken. Had refused a tip. Had just smiled and said it was no trouble. Mrs. Rossi had mentioned it to Eleanor. Had said this young driver, Daniel Hayes, had been so kind. So patient. Had treated her like she mattered even though she couldn't afford to tip well. Eleanor had filed that information away. Remembered the name. And when her regular driver quit 3 years later, she hadn't called the company and asked for anyone available. She had specifically requested Daniel. By name. The letter went on. Eleanor wrote that she had been testing him. Watching to see if that kindness Mrs. Rossi described was real or just a performance. So she'd been difficult. Demanding. Cold. Waiting to see if he'd snap. If he'd complain. If he'd treat her differently once he realized she was wealthy. But he hadn't. He'd just shown up. Been himself. And that's when she knew. That the kindness was real. That Daniel Hayes was exactly who Mrs. Rossi had said he was. A good man in a world that didn't reward good men. And Eleanor had decided, right then, that if she ever had the chance, she'd change that. Daniel sat there, staring at the letter, tears streaming down his face. Because it meant everything. It meant Eleanor hadn't acted on impulse. Hadn't been lonely or desperate or confused. She had been strategic. Thoughtful. She had seen something in him years before they became friends. Had given him a test he didn't know he was taking. And he'd passed. Not because he was trying to impress anyone. But because that's who he was. Claire watched him cry and then said, "She wanted you to know. That you earned this. That it wasn't luck. It was you." Daniel asked why Eleanor hadn't told him. Claire said Eleanor believed that if Daniel knew he was being tested, it would change how he acted. That he might second-guess himself. Try to be what he thought she wanted instead of just being himself. So she'd kept it secret. Had let their friendship develop naturally. Had let Daniel think it was just chance. But she'd wanted him to know eventually. Wanted him to understand that she hadn't chosen him on a whim. She'd chosen him because she'd seen his character long before they ever spoke. Daniel folded the letter carefully. Put it back in the envelope. Thanked Claire. She stood to leave. Then turned back and said one more thing. She said Eleanor had been wrong about a lot of things in her life. Had made mistakes. Had hurt people. But choosing Daniel hadn't been a mistake. It had been the best decision she ever made. And watching what he'd done with the foundation proved it. She said Eleanor would have been proud. And then she left. Daniel sat alone in his office, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of Eleanor's final gift. Not money. Not a house. But the knowledge that he had been seen. Really seen. And that he had been worthy of it. So what do we take from this? What does this story really mean? It's easy to call it a fairy tale. A rags-to-riches fantasy. But it's more than that. It's a reminder that we are all being watched. Not by cameras or algorithms. But by the people around us. The ones we think aren't paying attention. The ones we assume don't care. They see us. And sometimes, in ways we'll never expect, they remember. Daniel didn't win the lottery. He didn't get lucky. He just showed up. Day after day. Year after year. He was kind when no one was watching. He was honest when lying would have been easier. He helped an old woman carry her groceries without expecting anything in return. And years later, that small act of kindness changed his entire life. But here's the thing. This story isn't just about Daniel. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when we think no one is watching. The cashier who remembers your name. The teacher who stays late to help a struggling student. The neighbor who shovels your driveway without being asked. The stranger who holds the door. The person who smiles at you when you're having the worst day of your life. These are the people who make the world work. And most of them will never be rewarded. They'll never get $12 million. They'll never make headlines. They'll never know that what they did mattered. But it does. It always does. Eleanor spent 70 years building an empire. She was brilliant. Ruthless. Successful by every measure society uses. But at the end, none of that mattered. What mattered was connection. Humanity. Being seen as more than a bank account. And she found that in the most unexpected place. In the front seat of a car. With a driver who treated her like a person. Who listened without judgment. Who showed up without fail. And when she died, she made sure the world knew. That kindness matters. That decency matters. That the invisible people, the ones we walk past every day without noticing, they matter too. Daniel still lives in that small house. He still drives sometimes. Not for money. Just because he likes it. Likes the quiet. Likes the feeling of movement. He visits his mother every Sunday. He funds scholarships. He mentors students. He shows up. And every year, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, he visits her grave. Brings flowers. Sits for a while. And he says thank you. Not for the money. But for seeing him. For believing in him. For teaching him that a small life can still be a meaningful one. That you don't need to be rich or powerful or famous to matter. You just need to be kind. You just need to show up. And that, more than anything, is the legacy Eleanor left behind. Not a fortune. But a reminder. That we all have the power to change someone's life. We just have to care enough to try. We just have to pay attention. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs. Someone is holding a door. Someone is being kind when they think no one is watching. And maybe, just maybe, someone is. Maybe someone sees. And maybe, years from now, that small act of kindness will echo in ways we can't imagine. That's the real inheritance. Not money. But the knowledge that what we do matters. That who we are matters. That even in a world that often rewards the wrong things, kindness still has power. And sometimes, just sometimes, it wins. If stories like this make you think, feel, or see the world differently, subscribe now. This channel is for people who want more than headlines. We tell real stories. Human stories. Stories that stay with you long after the video ends. And if you think this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happened when a hospice nurse inherited everything from a patient she met only 3 times. That story is coming next. And trust me, it's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about kindness, manipulation, and the fine line between the two. What's your take? Was Eleanor's decision fair, or was it reckless? Would you have given the money away like Daniel did, or would you have kept it? How would you feel if you were in Daniel's position, suddenly thrust into a life you never asked for? And what about Eleanor's family? Do you think they had a right to contest the will, or were they just being greedy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And I want to know where you stand. Because this story, like all the best stories, doesn't have a clear answer. It just has questions. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is to make us think. To make us look at the invisible people in our own lives. To make us wonder who we might be overlooking. And to remind us that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest consequences.